Today is September 26, 2011. My name is Joe Bruckner. I'm at the Atlanta History Center in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm a volunteer with the History Center. And with me today is Tony Hilliard, who is also a volunteer with the History Center. And we're honored to have with us Craig Honaman. Craig is an Army veteran and a veteran of the Vietnam War, and he's kindly agreed to come in and share his experiences with us in connection with the Library of Congress Veterans History Project. Craig, we really appreciate you coming in, and we're honored to have you here.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Would you please give us your full name and current address?
My full name is Justin Craig Honaman. I go by my middle name. And current address here in Atlanta is 560 Cambridge Way, Atlanta, and that's in Sandy Springs.
Okay. And where and when were you born?
I was born in Montclair, New Jersey, June 15, 1943.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing.
Well, I was raised in the town of Glen Ridge, which was right next to Montclair, where I was born. The town of Glen Ridge was a small town, strictly commuter town out of New York City. The family was pretty standard back then. My father was in World War II. He served at Fort Riley, Kansas in the cavalry. Was unable to go overseas because of allergies, so he had to run the special services area, which was pool tables and ping pong. My grandfather, his dad, also lived in town, and he worked for Bell Telephone. He, early in his life, was able to acquire a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in electrical engineering. And in the 1950s, he served in the U.S. government as a loaned executive from Bell Telephone. He was in the Commerce Department and was Director of Strategic Information for the United States. He served in that office for a number of months, and then the Defense Department invited him over to be in a similar role as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Relations and Strategic Information. And he was responsible for all of the public relations from the Army, Navy, and Air Force in the Eisenhower administration for a number of months. Very controversial position because he had to decide what information was public and what information was not. And so the newspapers really honed in on that. He also, through the Bell Labs, participated in the development of sonar and radar, which were very key technologies for World War II. During those growing up years, I was heavily in Boy Scouts, earned Eagle Scout. My brother, I had two brothers and one sister. My older brother also earned an Eagle Scout. My dad was an Eagle Scout. And then back to my grandfather, he was also on the National Council of Boy Scouts of America for, I think it was about 30 or 40 years. Several decades of national participation with the Boy Scouts. And that really gave a lot of citizenship and leadership for the community. In Boy Scouts, I also was part of a civil defense unit that the Boy Scouts were supporting, which again gave kind of a community focus for the upbringing that I experienced. Also in the small town, as so many New England and northeastern towns have, I was a volunteer fireman and on the ambulance squad, which again was a volunteer situation. Graduated from high school in Glen Ridge, New Jersey in 1961 and went to North Carolina State for a bachelor's degree, or to earn a bachelor's degree. My parents drove me down to Raleigh, North Carolina, and they dropped me off and left, and that was the first day I set foot in North Carolina. So much for visiting colleges and seeing where to go. People ask, well, why'd you go there? And, well, they accepted me, and I'm going. It was a very tumultuous social time when I arrived there. Compared to my growing up years in New Jersey, which had a melting pot of ethnic and social groups, arrival at North Carolina, segregation was still in full effect. The football games that I would go to my freshman year, they would play Dixie as the opening piece of music, and then they'd play the national anthem. And you stood up. There was the War of Northern Aggression was still being considered here. So the social aspects were a real eye-opener for me. I also learned when I arrived at North Carolina State that ROTC was a mandatory requirement. It was a land-grant college, and all land-grant colleges back then were required to offer ROTC. North Carolina State had Air Force and Army, and they said, which one do you want? And I said, I'm Army. And so they said, fine. The first 2 years, of course, was mandatory, and then the second 2 years was elective. And I elected to stay in ROTC my junior and senior year. In my junior year, I also volunteered to help start a counterinsurgency unit, which was part of the ROTC group. And we would occasionally go down to Fort Bragg to visit the Special Forces Center, which was still really under development because John Kennedy as president was really instrumental of getting that well underway. And we as students were really there to observe and kind of get a feel as to what all counterinsurgency activities and Green Berets were all about. My senior year of college, the Army, as well as the other services like Air Force did, they came through and said, who wants to fly? And I said, hey, I'm in. I'll fly. They said, fine. We'll send you out to the airport to work on your private pilot's training and ticket. They paid all expenses for the lessons and mileage out and back. And so I did that, successfully earned my private pilot's license. And really, for the military, in hindsight, it was an easy way, a cheap way of sorting out who could fly and who couldn't. If you couldn't get your private pilot's license in the civilian market, don't even try active duty, which gets real expensive. And so it was an easy way for the military to really sort out who could fly and who couldn't. During my senior year also, the Army, as a routine, would ask the cadets for their branch of service requests. And they asked for 3 choices, one of which was supposed to be a combat branch, being armor, artillery, infantry. I put down Medical Service Corps for all 3 choices, and they never questioned it. And that was my choice, of course. I wanted to fly air ambulance. I had the aviation piece coming along, and I wanted Medical Service Corps, and they gave it to me. So that was something that I really appreciated, and in hindsight was one of those best moves I could make. Graduated as a second lieutenant in 1965, and was proceeded to go on active duty in March of '66. So there was about 6-7 months gap in there for me to go on active duty. Reported into Fort Sam Houston, Texas, and San Antonio for officer basic, and the basic training for officers at that point for the Medical Service Corps and all medical personnel really is at Fort Sam Houston. Was there, and I met 3 other men who were on the same military career pathway that I was on, and I'll refer to them a couple of times because there were basically 4 of us that tracked along all the way to Vietnam. After finishing the officer basic course, I then was ordered up to Fort Walters, Texas, which was really just straight north of San Antonio, so geographically it was an easy drive to my next duty station. Reported into Fort Walters for basic flight training. They had several hundred helicopters there, and they had 2 groups, commissioned officers, which was a smaller group, and then they had the warrant officers, warrant officer candidates that were the larger group, generally about 150, sometimes 200 of the warrant officers in flight training. My training was in an H-23, which was really an older single bubble type of helicopter. It was a great training helicopter because it was quite forgiving. and you could put it down pretty hard and it would generally hold together. It was a reciprocating engine, unlike the aircraft today, which are all turbines, and so the manner in which the controls were configured for fuel and power and pedal control was all a little different than what one sees today. And so one really had to learn to fly, and the techniques flying the helicopter were pretty intensive, because you had both arms moving, both legs moving, all at the same time, for different reasons. I spent 4 months there, and pretty uneventful, with one exception where the aircraft crashed. And in that case, the instructor, who was demonstrating a maneuver to me, did not do the maneuver correctly. The maneuver was to land to a point directly underneath you. And it was at a practice field, and we entered into the maneuver at 500 feet. And in order to land to a point underneath you, you have to back up on the point. So we cut the engine, and we started falling vertically. And he then started backing up on the point. And about 100 feet, he leveled it out and started to pull pitch to the rotor blade in order to stop the descent. But he had not cut the engine all the way off. And so he lowered the collective to cut the engine off, and by that time we were hitting. And we hit flat, bounced once to about a 45-degree angle. The tail of the aircraft separated, and meanwhile, as I always think back, and say, the ground jumps up pretty good at the last 75 feet. It comes up pretty quick on you. And I had remembered all of the training that they had talked about, where on accidents very often the rotor system and the transmission, which is right behind you, may come down into the cockpit. So I was sitting in the middle of the aircraft and leaned back very deliberately, so that if that thing came down through and swept through the cockpit with the rotor blade, I didn't want to be near it. I walked away from the accident. My instructor broke his back. And after everything stopped moving, I turned off the fuel and the power and disconnected batteries, and then took care of the instructor, laying them down to get wait for medical care. Exciting, no doubt. Following the training there at Fort Walters, I was then assigned to Fort Rucker in South Alabama for another 4 months of training. And that training involved instrument training, navigation, and gun training. I took certainly everybody had to have the training for gun sights and weapons, even though I knew I was not going to have those on my helicopter. But again, it was interesting to go through that training. At the end of that 4 months, I was then assigned to Fort Sam Houston, Texas, the 507th Medical Company, which was an aviation company, air ambulance, there at San Antonio. I volunteered for Vietnam, and they said, well, we're not sure we need you right now, so we're not going to order you to Vietnam. We'll wait and then order you later on. Meanwhile, while in San Antonio, I was sent to TDY, temporary duty, to Fort Ord, California. So myself and one other pilot from our unit had the only Huey in the 6th Army area. All the rest of them had already been shipped to Vietnam, from Seattle all the way down to San Diego. So we had the only Huey, and our mission was to support the Combat Developments Command at Fort Ord, and they had a firing testing range south of Fort Ord at a place called Hunter Liggett, and it was federal government land, and it was all computerized weapons testing targets and everything for testing all kinds of weapons, B-52 weapons, as well as over-under M16, M79 grenade launchers were all developed there. Our mission, again, was to just support them in the event something happened. Well, nothing happened while we were there, so we spent a lot of time roaming around, flying up and down canyons, chasing deer, hunting for wild boar, and occasionally going off the coast on the opposite, over the mountain range to hunt for whales. So So we had, we really did have a lot of fun flying around. It was very good training, being recently out of flight school. That mission was terminated, and I was sent back to the 507th, and that's when I was ordered to Vietnam.
And when was this?
This was in, well, May of 1967.
Okay.
I'd been just promoted about 2 months earlier to first lieutenant, so I was a first lieutenant at that point in time. Now, I mentioned 3 other individuals who we all went into service together. And so there were 4 of us who were went through all of the officer basic, the flight training, and then all ordered to Vietnam at the same time on the same set of orders. And we were on the same plane to go into Vietnam, and arrived at the 90th replacement, which was the ingress point for everyone coming into country. And then all of us were assigned different units to go to. And so the connections of those 4 of us were pretty strong. As it turned out, one of those 4 individuals subsequently was killed flying into the ground with night weather and vertigo. A second individual was heavily wounded flying in the DMZ. And the third individual is still MIA. And he's the only medical pilot that is still missing in action, and his whole crew. So I was the only one out of the 4 that happened to come back on time. Now, why me? That's always something that in life you often wonder. So I arrived in Vietnam, June 1967. I remember getting off the plane, and with a hot, humid, and the scent of all kinds of other things that you normally wouldn't smell, and with some trepidation, not knowing what to expect. I had heard all the stories about the terrorism and the insurgency, and not knowing who the enemy was. You always suspect for everybody, and you get on a bus to go to the 90th replacement, and there's screens on the window, and you ask why the screens? Well, to keep the grenades out, So it was a real eye opener upon arrival. Yeah. I was assigned from the 90th replacement to the 57th Medical Detachment helicopter ambulance. They were located at Long Binh, which is really about 6 or 7 minutes from the 90th replacement, where we all came into to be assigned. The unit was co-located with the 90th evac hospital, and then also at Long Binh there was the 24th evac hospital, which we brought patients into on a regular basis. So it was a major medical center. Our assignment location co-located with the hospital was very nice, because we had excellent food. We had pretty good laundry for sheets, clean sheets and everything. And there was always American nurses, which was a little different than most folks would encounter over there. The 57th was the original dust-off unit in Vietnam. They arrived around 1964, if I'm not mistaken. And they were assigned, based out of Saigon, but the aircraft they had were dispersed all over the southern part of the country. They really established the legacy for medevac. Their commanding officer at the time also selected the call sign Dust Off. The origin of that was that the Army gave the commanding officer several options for call signs, and he just liked the word dust off and picked that. There was no other analogy of dirt and dust flying around. It was a call sign in the book, which the Army has a large book of potential call signs. And because of that unit, or the people in that unit at the time, establishing what dust off could do, the word got so synonymous with medevac that it was the only call sign that never was changed in Vietnam. Most other units would have their call signs periodically changed, but dust off retained that because of the how it was synonymous for medevac. And the ground units, the ground troops got used to being able to say, just call dust off. And everybody knew what that meant. Moving forward from a more recent perspective, it's still used by the Army. And so it has had a staying power of a legacy of analogy to medical evacuation. That unit originally had B model Hueys, and subsequently, by the time I got there, the model of the aircraft was up to a Delta or D model Huey, which had a larger cabin. Now the Huey was originally designed, it started the design in the early 50s, and through the 50s, because the Korean War was using the bubble type helicopters with pods outside the cabin for the casualties, and they would put a cover over the casualty, and the casualties were on the skids in a pod. But they needed an aircraft that had interior configuration to be able to take care of patients. So the Huey was designed strictly for medevac, and the cabin width was precisely designed to be the width or the length of an Army stretcher. So you could slide the stretcher in and close both doors without handles sticking out. Unfortunately, the more recent aircraft that the Army and other services are using, that being the Blackhawks, they did not take that into account. And so the stretchers in those cases would have stretched outside the cabin until they reconfigured the interiors to take care of patients. But again, the aircraft, Huey aircraft, was originally designed for medical evacuation. The other services then, Army branches, found it to be so useful, they started to adapt it for other purposes, like gunships and resupply and communications and just a number of other uses. We were then using the D model Huey, which was basically underpowered for the environment. So we had to generally fly with anything we could get off the aircraft we didn't need, and that was half the fuel load. We didn't need all the fuel on board every flight. In our case, we were unarmed. We did not have machine guns mounted. Now, so there was some, at least one medevac unit that did have machine guns on that unit, and that was with the 1st Cav. But in our case, we had no armament on the aircraft other than sidearms in the event we had to protect ourselves on the ground. And that all gave us a little bit more capacity for patients on the weight factor than otherwise. So we were very careful on that. Adding in the heat factor in Vietnam, which then diminished the lift capabilities of any helicopter, we had to be very cautious as to how much weight we put on the aircraft. About halfway through my tour, those aircraft were upgraded to what they then designated hotel or H models, and basically that was a new engine, different engine, more powerful. And once we had those, we could do everything but sling load the world. We could anything you put in there, we could lift it out, which was nice to have. Our mission was covering 3 Corps and 4 Corps area of Vietnam, and that was basically the bottom half. Most of the terrain in 4 Corps, which was the Mekong Delta, was flat. Probably highest elevation in many parts was maybe 3 feet, and that was a rice paddy dike. But otherwise, it was at sea level and very, very flat. You could see for miles. That meant, too, that the enemy could see you for miles also. Now, the northern part of our operation area was beginning to get somewhat hilly and had some rivers, but also had triple canopy jungle. So we had a different type of topography in the northern part, and that being in 3 Corps as it stretched up to 2 Corps, which we really didn't get into. The triple canopy jungle always presented a problem because of trying to get into areas to pick up casualties. Our mission was to support certainly U.S. troops, but we also supported allies, South Vietnamese, Australians, civilians, and on rare occasion POWs. So we would fly any casualties as appropriate that we needed to for medical care. We were staffed with 2 pilots and 1 medic, trained combat medic, and a crew chief. And of course, the crew chief maintained the aircraft. But both of them were responsible to load patients when we landed in a landing zone. And once we started taking off, the medic was responsible for providing care for the patient. The medics were very, very well trained. And that certainly contributed to much of the survival rate of casualties we picked up by being able to put IVs into the wounded or injured to prevent shock. That was the killer. And once the patient got on board the aircraft, they had a real good chance of surviving if we picked them up alive. And mainly because of those medics. It was amazing when we were, zigzagging and trying to avoid enemy fire and jumping all over the sky, and those folks would be throwing IVs in an arm or a leg, or to be able to get that IV going to counteract shock. We generally flew one of 2 basic altitudes, very high and very low. If we were down over the delta, we wanted to be up pretty high until we had to get into an area. Then we got very, very low. I mean, we were 3 feet off the water. Doing about 120 knots, which is about 140 miles an hour. And when you got near the landing point, you had to stop. And that was always the trick of and technique of flying, is how do you stop that thing as you're coming in at high speed. When you're coming in over the trees, again, we did kind of a 180-degree diving turn to get down on the trees, and we leveled out on the trees doing about 120 knots. Occasionally you'd even get leaves in the skids, and at about a mile out from your landing point, you start trying to slow it down. During the day, we'd be landing to smoke, colored smoke, which had been pre-identified. At night, it could be most anything. It could be a cigarette lighter, it could be a flashlight, anything, or a strobe light, anything to give an indicator of where we're to touch down. And so in the black void that we'd be flying in at night, it was easy to see, and it could be miles away, and you could pick it up. When we landed, we were one of the few missions, helicopter missions, that had to land. Most other helicopters, resupply and other uses, they would kind of come to a hover, and if it's resupply, they'd be kicking out ammunition or food or bags of water. In our case, we had to touch down. And that also then caused us to be at higher risk. 90 seconds was our target. 90 seconds on the ground max. After that, things happen and they're all bad. So you want to get in and you want to get out. But if you get delayed, then the risk begins to go up. With that, flying medevac, as in hindsight, turns out to be one of the most hazardous types of flying in Vietnam by metrics and by measurements. At that point in time we were there, sure, we thought, well, we're hanging it out here a little bit, but with the statistics that have been derived over the last few years, it has shown that for pilots, not crew, but just pilots, the casualty rate of medevac pilots was 33%, either killed or wounded. Again, that was just an analysis of the pilots and not the crew. The crews certainly had also similar casualties, but those were the metrics. So why the casualty rate? Well, again, because we had to land, we were a target. We had the red crosses on the side. Geneva Conventions were not applied to, and even though we were highly visible and in some cases baited into situations, it was the fact that we had to come in and get slow, low, and land. Another was the Hoist Missions, which generally were required over the triple canopy jungles, that we could not land into, and we had to come to a hover at the treetops and drop a hoist down into the trees to be able to pull the casualty up through the trees. Hovering at treetop level gave the enemy a wider range of options to get around and get a shot at us. Couple that with Hoist Mission at night, where we had to have our searchlights on to be able to see down into the trees, and in the black voids, 10,000 candle power searchlight stood out for miles, and so that was always a high risk mission that was always shared. And the last point probably on the casualty rate was that we pushed it. We pushed the mission. Even though the ground units would say, yes, we have enemy fire coming from certain areas, but we got casualties, and we'd say, we're coming in. Put down heavy fire and give us all you got. And so we'd go in anyway. So there was times when you push it, and sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. But we always got the patient out, and that's what we were there for. It was all about the patients, and the ground troops knew that if they got wounded, injured, they knew dust-off was going to be coming for them, and that was really a force multiplier. I was impressed when I got there and throughout the time of my tour with the guerrilla tactics of the enemy. They were good. I mean, they really were hidden for during the day, and then at night they'd come out. And we'd occasionally, since we were so close to Saigon, drive down to Saigon for supplies and all. And we were always warned that you don't want to get any women or children near the jeeps or the trucks, because the women might have satchel charges underneath their flowing skirts, and the children may have hand grenades that just drop in the vehicle and run off. So one was always on point and on guard that what seemed to be civilians were really VC also, sympathizers, and willing to pull things like that. We supported a number of units from the 57th Med Detachment. We supported the 25th Infantry extensively at the Iron Triangle, the Bolo Woods, which were kind of nicknames of areas near their base camp of Cu Chi. We were into Cu Chi quite a bit. They also, at one point, it was a 4th Infantry Brigade at a place called Dao Tiang, and then they switched colors so that the 25th picked up that brigade, which made a lot of sense. Dao Tiang was an interesting place. It was a Michelin rubber plantation, and had a sizable airfield, as most of the plantations did in South Vietnam, because the French who built all of that needed to get around, so they built airfields at all the plantations, and the U.S. forces took them over and used them for air operations. But Dao Tiang, they also had a manor house, which had a beautiful swimming pool. So that was the officer pool, and so we could be sunbathing and swimming, and had all our flight suits and boots with zippers on it, and we get a call, we could zip everything on and be airborne in about 90 seconds and go off to war, bring back the casualties, turn them over to the hospital, and go back to the pool. So it was almost kind of surreal from that point. But Dao Tiang was just a nice, beautiful area, and the rubber trees provided a lot of shade. I was always told that the U.S. forces or U.S. government had to pay Michelin for every tree that was damaged, and so we were very careful about not damaging the trees. We also supported the 9th Infantry Division. 9th Infantry was further down the delta, south of Saigon. They had a very difficult area to fight in. It was all rice paddies. So they were always a target, and they took a lot of casualties, a lot of wounded. It seemed like constantly with the 9th Infantry. Again, because they didn't have any field cover. It was always in the rice paddies or behind rice paddy dikes, but you can only do so much there. We also supported the 11th Armored Cavalry Division, which was operating north of Long Binh. and certainly with all the heavy metal, all the tanks and armor, they could not get down in the delta because of the terrain and the soil conditions. So they really were up in some of the jungle areas. The calls we got from them, you just never knew where they were. And they would be out roaming around with these tanks and these armored personnel carriers pushing through the woods, and then they'd take a casualty, and they'd either have to use the tanks to knock down trees so we could land, or blow an LZ with C4 to knock down the trees, but they never had a clear open area. It was always maximum performance descent down into a hole, loading up the casualties, and then climbing out above the trees. So it was always interesting when we got calls from the 11th Armored Cav. The Australian base camp was down toward the coast, down towards Vung Tau, a place called Nui Dat. And we support the Australians with an aircraft every day to be available for their medical purposes. We were told, as far as I know is correct, that part of the arrangements to get the Australians to come into Vietnam, the commitment was made they would have a medevac aircraft to support them all the time. So that duty was rotated around, but they always had a medevac aircraft there. They were always traders. They would trade for anything. And so we mutually had some wonderful trades. They wanted Budweiser beer and we wanted the Victorian bitters. So we would just swap out beer for beer. Of course, Victorian bitter is about 14% and the Budweiser was about 3% alcohol. They thought they were getting a deal, and we thought we were getting better of them. But in any event, they were just a great bunch of men who were serving their country as well. We also supported the riverine forces, which were down in the Delta. They were in boats running up and down the rivers. We routinely take casualties from fire off the banks of the river, and so then we would be called. When I first arrived in country, we were called to support the riverine forces, and we would have to land on one of their boats, which had a platform on the back end of the boat, which was about 10 by 10. I mean, the boat itself was about 10, maybe 12 feet wide. And the skids of a Huey are about 10 feet long. So we would have to try and position the skids on that platform to be able to get the casualty into the aircraft. Well, the boat would never stop. They said if they stop, they'll take fire. Well, that meant they're driving down the river, so we're hovering sideways trying to get the skids on the boat, and as a pilot, you're hanging out over the water because the skids are behind you in the configuration of the aircraft. And so the moment we were able to get contact with the boat, of course, you put a 10,000-pound helicopter on a boat and it tends to wallow a little bit down into the water. But they had it pretty well worked out. They'd throw a chain over the skid and to be able to get the boat and the helicopter going together. And then they'd throw the casualty on, our crew would pull it on, pull the casualty on board, and then they'd immediately let go of the chain, which meant the boat went out from under you. And so you didn't have any lift at all. And so with the underpowered D model Hueys, even with one casualty on board and without any lift, we were occasionally dragging the skids in the water trying to get enough airspeed to get lift. That got to be such a hazardous maneuver that the Army told the riverine forces they had to find a secure beach location for us to come in and pick up the patients. So over a period of time that migrated to a more safe operation. But it really was interesting when we had the first couple of pickups that I was on to be on top of that boat. Another unit we supported was 173rd Airborne, and they just had a small area of operation compared to the divisions. We also supported the 1st Infantry Division, and then Special Forces and South Vietnamese Forces, different places. Special Forces always seemed to be out in the middle of nowhere, up near the Cambodian border, and it was a matter of then of finding them and being able to have somebody on the ground to be able to talk to. While I was there, we had one crew that was killed that was flying a mission near the mountain called Nui Ba Din. There's only one mountain down in that part of the country. You always knew where it was. This crew was on a night mission, bad weather, could not get into the area, that the landing zone, and made a missed approach, started climbing out, and the two pilots got disoriented. And the recording apparently that the air traffic control people recorded, they were fighting the controls, and neither of them was able to get control of the aircraft, and it crashed. So it killed the entire crew. And that the aircraft commander on that was a gentleman by the name of Tom Chiminella, and some of his memorabilia is in the museum at Fort Sam Houston for the medical academy there. The hoist missions I mentioned were particularly hazardous. We always rotated that around so that no one had that as a single mission, and everybody was always real cautious on those missions. We also, again, mentioned the trading with the Australians, but everything in Vietnam was a trade. And so we always were looking for opportunities to trade between different parties. And in one case we had an arrangement with the NCO, who was assigned to the 44th Medical Brigade, to assign all R&Rs. And as we visited with that person, we found that he wanted to go to the beach every weekend. So we said, well, that's fine, we can help on that if you can help us get all the R&Rs we want. And he said, fine. So every Friday afternoon we happened to have a maintenance aircraft and a crew that was off duty, and gee, we flew him down to the beach, and then Sunday afternoon we had a maintenance helicopter that just happened to be able to go down there and pick him up. And so for months our unit had all the R&Rs we wanted. Anything left over, he would call the first of the week and say, here's what I've got, who can go? So again, it was trade-off. Another one of the more memorable events that I had was Tet Offensive. On the morning of January 30, which was the first day of the Tet Offensive, 1968, I was on a mission. I had a mission to fly, which was really just a VIP mission from a hospital at Benoit to go down to take this an 06 colonel down to Saigon. The mission was to pick him up at 6 o'clock, 0600. I landed at the pad right at 0600 and radioed into inside the building that we were on the pad and ready to go. And they said, just stand by. As I sat on the pad, I looked out, and there was a security ditch, trench out in front, and I'd been in there many times before, and it was always empty. Well, that morning, it was full of infantry with weapons, all pointed out through the concertina wire. And I thought that was a little strange, but nobody had said anything to us. So I radioed back inside and said, asked whether the 06 was coming out. They said, well, he's concerned about his safety and security from our building to your helicopter. And I said to myself, here I'm sitting up 8 feet off the ground, and he's afraid to low crawl, out to my helicopter. And and they said, I said, why is that? And he said, well, we've been taking small arms fire all night. Well, okay, thank you for telling me. I'll turn out my lights. So I turned out the lights and tried to become invisible as possible, even making a lot of noise. Then finally they canceled the mission. So I took off, and our control center called us and said, can you take a medevac? I said, sure. We always took off able to perform a mission. So they gave me the coordinates, and I put them on the map, and as I put them on the map, I got a real question in my mind as to whether I got the coordinates correct. So I asked for confirmation of the coordinates, and they gave those to me again. And it was downtown Saigon. It was in the Cholon district of downtown Saigon. So I flew down there, got radio contact with the ground, and was able to then start my landing into the intersection of a street adjacent to the 17th Field Hospital. They could not move casualties by ground, so that's why they were calling us. As I started going down between the buildings, there were wires stretched between every building. The Vietnamese must steal power, electrical power or telephones back and forth across the streets. So I had to make a go around because I could not fly down between the buildings. I did a 360 turn at about 500 feet above the buildings. This was about 6:20 in the morning, when the blades were popping as normal Hueys do and making a lot of noise. I said to myself, I'm flat waking up the neighborhood in this early morning. Came around and did a maximum performance landing to the street intersection, and at that point was able to load the casualties. As I then figured, well, I came in okay that way, I'll go out the same direction, which was our standard procedure. Pulled up, did a 180-degree turn and started going up to the top of the buildings. Just started being able to get a little lift and started taking AK-47 fire off the rooftops. And I pulled all the power I could get, and that morning there was a cloud layer and some haze, and I was looking up just hoping I could get into that to hide. Meanwhile, out of the corner of my eye, I saw Cobra gunships making daisy chain gun runs off to the side, and I said to myself, well, these clouds may be full of aircraft, so I called out on the guard frequency that was coming out, and was able to climb up over the clouds and get back to Long Binh, and we had taken hits in the tail of the aircraft as we were coming out. So again, the Huey was able to sustain a lot of damage. While I was flying over there, I carried a lot of survival gear, and this is a photo of myself that shows I was wearing a survival vest. In Vietnam, if you got shot down, you had to take everything that was attached to you out the aircraft. Could not expect to have any time to collect your weapons or survival gear, so you want to have everything tied onto you or part of it. And so I had a survival vest, I had a survival map, which was a rubberized map that was for all Southeast Asia, and I had some other survival knives and gear in the event I was shot down and had to survive on the ground. I carried a M1 carbine rather than a regular weapon. It was because a little shorter. I figured that if I could grab it and get it out of the cockpit easier than an AK-4 or an M16, it'd be better for me to get out. Fortunately for me, I had never had to try that because I never was actually shot down. I took hits in the aircraft, but was able to fly it back to secure areas. When we were supporting the 25th Infantry, they were, again, always in the mix of getting casualties and heavy fighting. We had a situation where they had multiple casualties, and they called us in. They were still under fire. We landed, and as we landed, noticed that the ground troops were all laying in the grass, right where we were landing. And our crew got out to get the ground troops to bring their casualties over to the aircraft, and they would not stand up to bring the casualties over. So our crew had to go get the casualties and bring them over to the aircraft, load them up, and we got out of there. We had to do that 2 more times, so another time during the daylight hours and then once at night. And each time the ground troops, because of their enemy action, would not stand up to help us load. Another occasion with the 25th Infantry, they had to blow an LZ, knock down trees for me to get in. I was able to land and put one skid up against one of the trees that were laying in the LZ for stability, and our crew started loading casualties. And kept pulling power and kept pulling power, just sitting there. And I kept asking, are you loaded? No, sir, we're still loading casualties. And finally they said, okay, we're ready to go. And so I pulled power, and fortunately I had that H model Huey and was able to climb right out. And I said, well, y'all in and buckled in? No, sir, we're out on the skids, we can't get in. And they filled up the entire cabin with casualties. And I asked them to count, how many do we have? And they said, we have 12 casualties and a crew of 4, so we came out of that area with 16 Americans on board. Again, because of that engine that was able to provide us the necessary.
Is that the
power.
largest load of casualties you ever
Yes.
evacuated?
Yeah, and they're all Americans, which then the body weight adds to it versus Vietnamese. We normally calculate Vietnamese 2 for 1 almost for body weight, for weight and balance in the aircraft. There were occasions also when we would get out to our pad and there would be 2 Red Cross, would be nicknamed donut dollies on the pad, powder blue dresses, very nice young ladies, and we said, well, where are you going today, ladies? And do you need a ride? Yes, we need a ride. We're going to such and such place. By golly, we were going to the same place.
Coincidence.
Coincidence. And so wherever they wanted to go, we would take them. And that was always fun. And in Vietnam, there was always some humor, some humorous activities. And one of the items that was always a little humorous and fun was an award our unit would give to those people in a crew that would have their first occasion of having their aircraft hit with enemy fire, and it was called the Certificate of Magnetism. And basically it was to recognize that the maintenance officer did not look kindly to you on damaging his aircraft, and that it was to recognize that the friends and neighbors could refer to the individual as old magnet ass, and with no relation to a jackass at all. So it was, again, a humorous attempt to make light of something that you sure didn't want to have happen. You just didn't want to be hit with enemy fire. I was awards and decorations officer for our unit, and took a lot of pride in recognizing the entire unit on their missions. Every mission our people went out on, I would do follow-up visits with them to see whether they had exposed themselves for heroism awards or any type of appropriate recognition. And at one point, every one of our personnel in our unit had at least one award for heroism or recognized for valor, which all of them deserved. As I submitted recommendations for awards, the 44th Medical Brigade, which was our next higher command, would routinely deny a lot of the awards. And that was very frustrating, so I went to talk with the lieutenant colonel who was responsible for that, and he was pretty candid. He said if we gave dust off all of the awards that they deserved, we would have nothing left for anybody else. And I said, well, still, that doesn't help us. And he said, well, that's the way it's going to be. And that was unfortunate that attitude was there. We rarely carried DOAs, but there was one occasion when I was asked to carry some DOAs, and that was in support of the 1st Infantry. There was a ambush of a company. Really, I think it was probably a reinforced company, a little over 200 men, totally wiped out, and I was called and got to the location and found that there were no wounded. They were all KIA. And when I found that out, I shut the aircraft down, and my medic, along with 2 or 3 ground infantrymen, went into the ambush area and looking for wounded, and they could not find any. So they came back out, and then the ground forces asked me to fly out the officers. And I said, sure, since I wasn't waiting for any wounded, which would be first priority, certainly. One of those individuals turned out to be a Major Don Hollander, who was an All-American football player for West Point. And I think after a couple of years, one of the athletic centers, activity centers at West Point is named after him. But I flew him out that morning back to Lyke along with several other DOAs. Very unfortunate. Again, there were no wounded, and that meant the VC had time to go through the area, kill any wounded, and they stripped the bodies of boots, shirts, and and certainly all the weapons. So then I returned from Vietnam in June of 1968. Our unit informal policy was that in the last 30 days of our tour, we would not fly combat missions. We would just strictly be assigned what they nicknamed ash and trash missions, things that were administrative flights. So that, and then all the other unit pilots would pick up the slack of the one pilot or maybe more who were less than 30 days out from going home. And that was just something we did on our own. It was not an official type of thing, but all of our pilots knew you make it 11 months and, you know, pretty good for that 12th month then. When I returned in 1968, June of 1968, I flew back to New York or New Jersey, and my grandfather and my father picked me up, and it was pretty insulated to any of the I'll say protests and all. Our town was all patriotic, so you really didn't have a lot of the protest movements that you saw around other places. We were warned about that as part of our orientation coming back into the country. Suggested not to wear the uniform. I did anyway. I was proud of it, so I was going to wear my uniform. I was assigned to Fort Rucker. I was a captain by that time, and had various awards and decorations from combat service. I was assigned to the unit called Flatiron, which is the Crash Rescue Air Ambulance unit to support the aviation school there at Fort Rucker. So really we flew crash rescue and air ambulance for South Alabama and North Florida, moving mainly military patients that happened to end up in a civilian hospital out to the military installations. One of the probably most memorable events that I had there was almost flying into high tension wires, because I was flying low level and didn't realize that the wires were there. Caught the wires out of the corner of my eye, and you had three choices. You either try and go under them, which was not a real good option, doing a 100 or 90-degree turn in which you'd float into them. The other option was flaring and pull all the power, and know the characteristics of that helicopter, and having flown in Vietnam, that if you flare it, it'll pop up. And I popped up enough to get above the wires, and by the time I leveled out the aircraft, the skids were on top of the wires, cleared the wires, and then I was in the clouds. And so I was in instrument conditions immediately. Was able to climb up enough to clear the wires and do a 180-degree turn and fly back. And as I've talked to pilots since that over the years, most of them agree that 99% of the people would be killed because of that type of situation. And I said, well, was it wires that they'd strike? They said, no, it's the instrument conditions that you pop into, that you don't transition from visual to instruments, and if you're not used to that. Well, in Vietnam, we were used to that all the time. Yeah. So it wasn't any, there was no problem with that transition for me.
You were well trained.
Well, that's right. I flew there at Fort Rucker a little over a year. And meanwhile, I asked the Army to send me back to graduate school, because I said, gee, I enjoyed the Army per se. Some days I didn't want to be where I was at, but otherwise the Army was good. And would they send me back to the Baylor program at Fort Sam Houston for a Master's of Healthcare Administration? And they said, well, if you had 8 years of service, and I only had 3, we'd think about you. And oh, by the way, you've been back in the States a year. You're due to rotate back to Vietnam if you extend your obligation. I said, thank you very much. I'm out. I separated from the Army on May 31, 1969, and started a graduate school program at the University of Alabama, Birmingham on June 1st, the next day, for a Master's of Healthcare Administration. Worked on that for 15 months on campus, And then at the completion of my academic portion, I went down to Baptist Hospital in Pensacola, Florida, to do a residency and subsequently stayed on. When I arrived at Baptist Hospital, they had just finished a construction project which happened to include a heliport on top of the roof. And I had done my master's thesis on designing hospital-based heliports. So I was able to proceed to get the heliport licensed in the state of Florida as a licensed facility. The state of Florida had never done that before and didn't know how to do it, but since I had done all the homework and research, I was able to provide to the state of Florida the necessary forms and characteristics to evaluate hospital-based heliports, both rooftop and ground level. A second project, though, that my boss there in Pensacola asked me to handle was to figure out how to use helicopters financially feasible and for patient care in civilian hospitals. And because of the Army training, knowledge, awareness of characteristics and how helicopters could be dealt with, I was able to develop the financial feasibility for a hospital-based helicopter program and also the patient care results, that being lives saved. And we were focused in Pensacola on a medium-sized community. There were two other programs ahead of us that were in large cities, Houston and Denver. But since we were able to show the financial feasibility and the patient results, it opened up the nation for the use of helicopters with hospitals in the civilian market. So we pioneered the use of helicopters nationwide because of that. The percent of lives saved, and I did studies over the course of about 3 or 4 years, started out at about 11% of the patients we transported would have died had they not been transported by helicopter. And over the course of the 4 years, that ranged from that 11% up to 20%. So as the number of programs nationwide grew, that percentage became more and more accurate. Along the way, I was recognized with 2 awards, one from MBB Helicopters, which was the Golden Hour Award, which was an annual award recognizing pioneering use of helicopters in hospitals. And then in 2004, the National Aeronautics Association presented an award for the Public Benefit Flying Award that they award each year to somebody nationwide.
Congratulations.
Well, thank you. I'm a member of the Dust Off Association, so I stay in touch with not only the folks who flew in my era, but then the folks that are flying today. And somewhere in the world, every day, there's a medevac out on a mission somewhere. And so one can always realize that that they're out there doing the job every day throughout the year. Certainly volunteer through AVVBA, the USO activities, and that's always fun. From a personal note, I've been married for 40 years. I have a son, lives here in Atlanta, vice president of Coca-Cola, and a daughter who also lives here in Atlanta, and she works for a company on marketing wireless technologies.
Wow.
So, okay.
Well, I have a few questions.
Good.
Concerning some things you mentioned. You said that one of the missions of Dust Offs was periodically to rescue POWs.
Yes.
Did you either directly or indirectly ever get involved in something like that?
Yes, I had one in particular, and whenever we had a POW that was called in for transport, we always insisted that they have armed guards with them. This case, though, since any POW we were transporting, they had to be wounded or injured, so they're not going to be too resistant.
Yeah.
I picked up one casualty to fly him into Long Bend because there was a POW hospital unit there at Long Bend. And as I was en route, and I heard a large or loud scraping sound in the back of the aircraft. And whenever you have a scraping sound of any sort, you get real concerned. So I got on the intercom and asked the crew, what was that? And they said, well, this POW was not talking, and the interrogator got aggravated and was sliding the stretcher across the cabin floor and was going to dump them out. And so I said, okay. And so then everything got quiet, and a couple minutes later I got on the intercom again. I said, okay, what's going on now? And they said, the POW is talking. And so that was one of those situations that, taking advantage of the situation of altitude and, scare tactic to have the POW, there. I might also digress for just a moment. One of the things I did throughout my tour, I carried 2 prayer books in my vest pocket. Both are Episcopal prayer books that were given to me by the Episcopal Church before I went over.
Really?
And throughout the year I was in Vietnam, there would be occasions when it was a particularly, hazardous or scary moment, and I'd get back and to the, our standby location, and kind of go off to a quiet corner of some sort and pull out the prayer books and say a few prayers. But I carried these books throughout my tour in my left breast pocket.
Yeah, that gave you some comfort, didn't it?
It sure did. It's nice to have some kind words available.
Did you have much contact with the civilians while you were in Vietnam?
Not a whole lot of contact. Our main contact was for maids who cleaned our living facilities and did our laundry. And those women would come on base every day. Some of them were VC. We would know that, but hard to pin down.
Yeah.
Some of them were basically scouting the locations. They all pretty much smoked marijuana, and you got used to that smell. In our unit, we did not have a problem with drugs or anything because people in or around helicopters or aircraft, they just didn't do that. And so we didn't have a problem that a lot of notoriety might come through.
I mean, your missions always involved, or normally involved, wounded soldiers, and I know your main goal was to accomplish the mission safely, but what kind of emotional impact did that have while you were there, day after day, seeing these wounded soldiers and knowing you were saving their lives?
Well, emotionally, it didn't. For me, it did not have any, real impact. To some degree, the pilots were in a kind of, I'll say, a little bit removed. Sure, I would occasionally look over my shoulder to see what was going on in the back, and there might be blood going all over the place, and the medic is trying to cover up with gauze and other bandages problem areas. But in my case, it was looking at the instruments, making sure the aircraft was running correctly and flying correctly, and or me flying it myself. So the attention and focus was not so much on the unfortunate wounds that we saw.
Yeah.
So there was really not a whole lot of connection that way.
Okay. Have you been back?
No, I've never been back to Vietnam. I've thought about it often. My whole view of the war was from 1,500 feet, and it's a beautiful country. It was beautiful then. It's probably just as pretty now from 1,500 feet. You'd fly over the plantations and the trees, whether it be a banana plantation or rubber plantation, everything was lined out just perfectly into the jungles were carved out, and the manor houses and the layout of the plantations were just beautiful, very, very lush. The Delta area could be a food bowl for all of Asia, with the amount of rice it could produce. With perhaps with some technology that maybe is there now, but in any event, my view was from that high altitude vantage point. So going back, there'd be very little on the ground that I'd really look forward to see.
Tony, do you have any questions? Yeah. Before we finish, I want to be sure you have a chance to say anything else you want to say, anything you meant to say that you didn't, or any message to the people that are going to watch this in the near future or down the road.
But you know, life takes some funny turns, and there's some things that you just can't plan for. It just happens. And in my case, I think there were a number of very, very fortunate things that came up that I did not think of or even try and plan. One was to get to North Carolina State and, you know, having mandatory ROTC, and I said, "What's ROTC stand for?" and in reality, that was just a great opportunity for me. Having the Army enable me to fly, gave me the training to fly. Flying medevac that I was able to, you know, come through to get that type of mission, because with my upbringing and having served the community and having my family and ancestors all the way back to the Revolutionary War, having served the country one way or another, to be able to serve the country as well as serving our fellow soldiers was a very fortunate situation. And then being able to get into graduate school and then being assigned to Pensacola Baptist Hospital, and the gentleman I worked for, who happened to be a former Marine, World War II Marine pilot, flew in the Pacific, and he knew aviation certainly, and saw the aviation in me, and being able to say, "Here, do this project to figure out how we can use helicopters." Yeah. And we did have some successful failures on the business model, and he kept saying, "Okay, forget that one, go on to the next one." And it was not a program failure. It was just, gee, that those facts didn't line up. Let's try something else. Yeah. And so his faith in me to be able to move forward, and that has always been a real kind of success. And again, you can't plan that in life. And having the family I do, you know, it all just kind of falls together.
Well, I want to thank you for coming in here, but even more than that, I want to thank you for what you did for our country. Number one, in Vietnam, where you obviously were very courageous, even though you probably won't admit that, but you saved lives. There's no doubt that what you did saved lives. And it sounds like you also were responsible for saving lives once you came back with the programs that you were working on. So you're a real patriot, and you're having a fascinating life, and I want to thank you for what you've done for the country, and again, thank you for coming in here and sharing your story.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity.